Welcome to the 4 Habits podcast, where we help you build relationships that thrive at home, at work, and in life. We're Dr. Andrea and Jon Taylor-Cummings, and every week we bring you actionable insights to create meaningful connections and lasting success. So let's dive in.
So today we're in for another fascinating story, this time around reclaiming your story and building healthier relationships from the inside out. We have the pleasure of being in conversation with Dr. Liz DeBetta, all the way from Detroit, Michigan. Welcome, Liz.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm so thrilled to be here.
We're so looking forward to diving in, but as usual, before we do, we need to give you the proper introduction. So John's going to share a bit of your bio.
All right, I always love doing this bit. So Dr. Liz DeBetta is a powerhouse in personal transformation. As an adoptee, writer, performer, and trauma-informed coach, she empowers others to reclaim their stories, reconnect with their identities, and lead with authenticity. Her journey began with a pivotal realization: the story she was handed wasn't the one she needed to live. Through her signature methodology, Migrating Toward Wholeness, Liz helps individuals, particularly those impacted by adoption, identity trauma, and disconnection. She helps them heal through expressive writing. She is the author of Adult Adoptees and Writing to Heal, and the award-winning performer of Unmothered, and we'll talk about that in a bit, a story of adoption and patriarchy. Whether through her coaching, workshops, or stage performances, Liz calls people to face their truth, reconnect with themselves, and build healthier relationships from the inside out. Fascinating. So tell us about your passion. How do you see personal identity shaping the way that we build relationships and we lead others? How do you see that?
That's such a great question, and so important for me because I spent so much of my life not knowing who I was, not having an identity that was fully my own, because the culture of closed adoption is such that I did not have any access to my biological heritage. I didn't know what my ethnicity was. I was living in a family that I wasn't biologically connected to, and it took me a really, really long time to figure out who I was, how I could show up in the world, and what I wanted as a result of that. And so for me, personal identity is integral to living a truthful existence. It's integral to living an authentic life where you can show up fully human and fully integrated. And we can probably get into some of the integration piece a little bit later, but I think that we all, and in terms of leadership, I don't think that I would be the leader that I am if I hadn't been able to step into my authenticity.
Indeed, and to be that integrated whole. And as you say, we can unpack that some more.
Yeah, so I guess otherwise you spend the first however many years of your life trying to figure out, who am I? So how long did it take for you to get to that sort of first level of realization as to who you really are?
Yeah, what was that journey like?
Okay, I'm glad we're all sitting. Yeah, so it took me almost 4 decades. It took me until I was about 37, 38 years old to realize how stuck I was, to realize, I talk about it in the original version of Unmothered. There's a section that's not currently in the new version, but where I say I hit a wall. And that wall was a wall of my own building, essentially, because I had spent the first 35 plus years of my life living with a story that was handed to me, living with all of the narratives about why I was adopted, why my parents adopted me and my brother, why adoption is supposed to be this thing that you're grateful for, without having the nuance of the both and of the situation. And I had hit a point in my life, as I said, in my late 30s, where I realized that I had all of these patterns that kept repeating themselves, and that if I didn't do something to figure out why I kept doing that to myself, I was never going to move forward. I felt very much like a hamster on a wheel. moving fast all the time, constantly going, but never getting anywhere. And I knew that I sort of had a little bit of a come to Jesus with myself, where I had to get curious about what was going on. I don't think I would have called it curiosity at the time, but
Mm.
in retrospect, I had to get curious because I needed to figure out how to, and I'll put this in quotes, fix myself,
Mm.
because I knew that what I had been doing for years wasn't working anymore. So it was also at this point in time, because I had this like aha moment, and I thought, okay, well, I'm never going to have the kind of relationship with another person that I want if I keep choosing these really toxic situations, these really unhealthy relationships with very emotionally unavailable people. And I had never really explored the impact of adoption on my life. And it was also at the same time that after a huge break in my education, because of some of these toxic relationships, because of like family expectations, I did not finish the last 2 credits of my master's degree. And I had the opportunity at this point in time to do that. And for me, school has always been a really big coping mechanism. And so it felt like, well, I know I need to finish this degree because I knew I wanted to go back to teaching. I knew I needed to make some changes and some shifts in my life. And school made sense to me. I was like, well, this is a thing that I, have had hanging over my head for more than 10 years now. And it's time to prioritize me.
Yeah.
And so I was admitted back into the program. And to this day, I couldn't tell you why, but the coordinator of the program had a meeting with me, and she suggested that even though I didn't need to take another class, that I consider taking another class. And I said, sure, no problem. That sounds like a great idea. And she suggested that I take a class in autobiographical writing. And I was like,
Oh,
oh,
really?
yeah.
Okay.
I said, okay, that sounds cool. I had never, I had been writing privately and secretly my whole life, writing poems and little stories and things, but I had never taken a formal creative writing class. Up to that point, I had done a lot of academic writing, a lot of, sort of standard educational writing. And it was my first time taking a formal creative writing class. And I thought, okay, cool. I struggled. I had such a hard time because the big project was to write a personal narrative about a significant life event. And I was like, I don't know. I don't know what I'm going to write about. I don't have any stories that I think are worth telling. And then one night in class, one of my classmates was reading a story, that her draft of her story that she had written, and it was about her sister and about how everybody mistook them for twins their whole life, and how they had all these same mannerisms and they were so close. And I just sat there and cried.
Well,
And everybody was like, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "No, I don't think I am."
Mm.
And I said, I'm adopted. I have no idea who I look like. I have no idea if I have any siblings out in the world. Um, and and like I just can't even imagine what it would be like to look at another person who looks like me.
wow.
And my professor said, "Why don't you write about that?"
Yeah, there's a
Hit
subject.
the nail on the head all at once.
Mm-hmm.
That must have been
So,
such a powerful
just to
story.
clarify, I guess, for my mind and for anybody else listening
Yeah,
in, the brother, you said you had a brother, but that's also adopted, so not same parent.
correct.
So you literally had no idea of anybody else who could look like you, act like you, same genes, no connection, no link. Wow.
No, no. And like, we were white kids adopted into a white family, and we looked just similar enough to our
Mm-hmm.
parents that unless people knew we were adopted, like it didn't really come up.
Right.
And so sort of we were like, passing in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the things that, that was kind of detrimental in my growth and my experience, was that we stopped talking about adoption. There and then because we stopped talking about it, when I started to have my internal angst about all of the things, I didn't know how to talk about it. I didn't know how to ask questions. And that's where the early writing came from, right? The early writing was my way of expressing all the things that I was holding inside but couldn't say to anybody.
So before you get to that, you stopped talking about it. When did you actually start talking about it? When did your parents let you know that you were adopted and that?
Yeah, so I mean, we always knew. I don't remember not knowing, which
Okay.
actually is a good thing. And colleagues and friends of mine have done research on this, and the research says that you're supposed to tell a child before the age of 3, as early as
Okay.
possible, so that they can begin so that they can begin integrating the fact that they are adopted
Mm.
into their
Your
identity,
identity.
Right.
right? So that was a thing that my parents got right.
Mhm.
They told us, we knew it wasn't a secret, but then it became a secret again
Mhm.
when we stopped talking about it.
And how long was that? What age was that? And did you stop talking about it?
I'd say that probably happened sometime like, sometime in middle school, junior high school age, like between like 5th and 7th grade.
Which is how old for people who aren't in that system?
So, oh, sorry, yeah. So that's probably between the age of like 12 and 14.
And is that when you started, or do you remember when you started questioning your identity before that landmark moment at 37 or 38? Was this a question that you carried?
Oh, yes. I think I always questioned my identity because as much as I loved my family and had so much, support and love and care and, access to opportunity and education and all of that, I never felt like I fit, and it wasn't a thing that at 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 or 14 that I could have articulated.
Hmm.
Um, it was just a feeling that I had inside. And I spent a lot of time as a kid reading as a way of escaping.
Mhm.
I read all the time. Like if you didn't know where I was like sitting in a corner with a stack of books
Mhm.
because it was easier for me to live in those other worlds than to deal with the confusion that I felt inside about knowing that I was adopted, about knowing that I had another mother out there in the world, but I didn't know what she looked like. I didn't know where she was. And I didn't know, if she thought about me, if she wanted to know me. And those were things that I could never say out loud.
Yeah.
And funny story, because we just passed St. Patrick's Day. St. Patrick's Day was my favorite holiday as a kid. And I grew up in a very Italian American family.
Okay.
And we celebrated it every year because it was my favorite holiday. And my little tiny Italian grandma would make the pot of corned beef and cabbage and bring it over, and we would do the thing. And when I did my DNA at 40 years old, guess what?
Hmm.
Italian.
I'm almost 40% Irish
Well, Irish.
and zero, like a 0.5% Italian,
Yeah.
and that's only because the DNA
Yeah.
has shifted in the last 3 years.
Yeah. 40% Irish.
Almost, yep.
Yeah. No wonder the St. Patrick's Day was in Yeah.
My body knew.
Yeah. Amazing. And so, what did you actually do to create a healthy identity and start really building relationships in a healthy way inside out?
Yeah, so I mean that's where the writing comes in. As I said, it took me till my late 30s to start to figure out that I needed to have first a healthier relationship with myself so that I could have healthier and better relationships with other people, because that was up to this point that was not happening.
Mhm.
And so this first opportunity in that autobiographical writing class to struggle through how to write and tell my story was the sort of pivotal moment, because in that experience I realized that I did have a story to tell, and that it was an important story, and that it was a story that first I needed to hear, that I needed to write so that I could make sense of the things that didn't make sense to me up to that
Mhm.
point, right? All of those unanswered questions that I had
Mhm.
about who this mother was, and why she gave me away, and why I was not supposed to ask questions about it. Um, and then when I started sharing that story, I realized it was a story that other people needed to hear. And so that sort of pushed me into what is now migrating toward what has now become migrating toward wholeness, because then I decided that I was going to continue on and get my PhD. And I took a class called Poetry and Healing very early on in my coursework, and I was like, haha, this is the thing I have been doing my whole life. I have been helping myself through writing without knowing it. And so when I started to write new poems to fill in the gaps in my story, to make meaning out of the incoherent storyline that I had, that I had been given because of being adopted, um, I started to be able to see a clearer picture of who Liz was, is, and could be. And that was really a pivotal moment for me, because I realized that I had been using writing to manage my overwhelming emotions for many years, but that I could also use writing to fill in the parts of my narrative that were missing, to create a coherent storyline, and ultimately as finding a place of healing and as a way of identifying myself to myself. And what also happened is that when I got into my writing my dissertation, which is where Unmothered came from, I started to go back to all of my early poetry. And I started to be able to look at younger me and realize how much grief and how much pain I was holding, that if anybody had bothered to look at it, they would have maybe, yeah, they maybe would have seen it. They maybe would have asked different questions or better questions, or just asked some questions at all. And it might have given me an opportunity to explore who I was. But it took me doing my DNA, doing this PhD work, to really start to figure out who I was, because I could finally tell my own story.
And so have you been, sorry, I have all the questions firing up, 2 questions. Have you made any connections or contact with your mother or your family to help, the biological family, to help fill in those dots? And then I'll answer the next question. I'll separate them, just that one.
Yes. So in 2017, I was able to get a copy of my original birth certificate, which was the same time that I spit in the tube and sent the DNA test away.
Okay.
And so, because that's how most adoptees find biological family, is by doing DNA tests, because we don't have access otherwise, for the most part, particularly in the US, where records in almost every state are still closed. There's, because it's a individual state issue, and many states refuse to change the laws, which is a whole other conversation. But I got, ironically, how's this for a story? On my 40th birthday, I got the copy of my birth certificate in the mail. Yeah, I remember, because I was working from home that day, and it was my birthday, and there was a snowstorm, and we were supposed to go out to dinner, and then my partner called and asked how I was doing, and I said, could you just maybe pick up Thai food on the way home, and like, let's just stay home and open a bottle of wine and have some Thai food and not go out in this crappy weather. And also because I had had this envelope sitting on the kitchen counter that I was not going to open until he got home. And so that was just one of those weird quirks of the universe that was sort of like, here you go, happy birthday.
Happy 40th.
Happy 40th. Yeah, like, this is a milestone. Here you go. You get to finally know who your biological parents are. And so when I opened it, I only my first mom's name is on there. And so then, because of Facebook and the internet, which we didn't have, 25 years before, when I first started thinking about all of this, we were able to locate her pretty quickly. And then I took about 10 days to think about how I was going to reach out, what I wanted to say. And then I sent her a Facebook message, and then I hand wrote the same message and put it in the mail in case she didn't check Facebook message, because that's wonky sometimes.
Mhm.
And then I waited to hear back from her.
Wow.
And then she got back to me and she said, I have been waiting for this day for 40 years.
Well, how long was your wait? How long did you have to wait from sending the message off to hearing back?
I'm going to say maybe about a week.
Okay. Yeah, like a
I
year of trauma and sitting there. Wow. Okay.
no.
Sense of folks, right? That's just
Yeah, I just sort of had to like put that out and just like try to go about my business and keep breathing and
Mm.
and hope that she responded,
And tell us about that reconnection moment. So she responded and said what?
So she responded and she said, I've been waiting for this day for 40 years.
Mm.
I am so happy you contacted me. I'm glad that you're okay. I want you to know anything that you want to know. I'll tell you anything that you want to know, as much as you can handle.
Mm.
Um, and so we started, sending messages back and forth, and then we, after a couple of days, kind of graduated to email because there was so much, and
Mm.
then there was so much in the email that then we just decided to start talking on the phone, and so we had, several phone conversations, and it's, now that was about 8 years ago, I guess. Yeah, it's about 8 years ago.
Mm.
And so it's been a slowly progressing relationship, but a good one, because I did always have the inner knowing that if I was ever able to find her, I knew that she would want to know me.
Right.
I knew that
Mm.
instinctively. I don't know why. I just always knew that, and that was true.
Mm.
yeah. That's that's such a powerful story to share and to encourage others on their journey of not knowing. How do you work with others to find or to reclaim their story, especially when they're missing bits or where the ending isn't so great, or if they're not good at writing? I don't know.
Mm.
How do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, that's the power of what I have learned in my own experience, right? Going through my own exploration of my own story and my own writing process to develop the process that I now use to work with others, because it helps people who, and I hear this all the time, but I'm not a writer. You don't have to be a writer. It's not about how you write, it's about what you're writing and what that's telling us about your internal experience. And
Mm.
so the way that I work with other people, the way that I support other people through this process is there are 5 core principles in the process that are making space to heal, rewriting the truth, expressing the core or primal wound, becoming the subject, and the 5th one is breaking silences. I have to think about them like as a there's a graphic. Right,
Wow.
and it's a wheel because they're constantly in motion and they're interconnected pieces, and we're getting at a lot of those things concurrently, but then
Mhm.
each of those things are connected to the 7 parts of trauma healing,
Mm.
so that so as an example, one of the things that has just come up in my story is this fight for authenticity, right? This fight for identity and learning who I am. And there's lots of offshoots of that, feeling worthy, feeling like you're enough. And those are things that are really typical with most trauma survivors, but specifically adopted people, because there's this lifelong disconnection, this lack of biological mirroring, and people that have attempted to connect with biological relatives and may have been rejected again,
Mm.
right? And so then there's that re-traumatization. And so when I work with folks, we either work individually or in small groups in order to give people the opportunity. Like, trauma needs a container, right?
Mhm.
And for most of us, the container is our body until we learn to express it elsewhere. And so the writing then becomes the container. And so that's why it's not about how you write, it's about what you write. And so we use 2 basic types of writing, one of which is acrostic poems. And those are very structured. types of writing that help us to name and define and contain overwhelming thoughts, feelings, and emotions in order to then be able to explore them more deeply. And the other thing we do is a lot of free writing, because that allows us to use the uncensored, unedited part of our brain to connect to the deeply held feelings. They'll break those silences, right? To say the things out loud we might not have been able to say before. It's giving ourselves, I call it a radical act of self-permission and self-love, to just allow yourself to put pen to paper. And what ends up happening is that because it's a group of people that share the same lived experience, people feel safe to go there to explore those things. And because I'm sharing my experience and my story as a mirror, and our stories become mirrors for one another. And that's where part of the healing happens, is because we start to express and open up and say the things that we can't say to the people in other parts of our lives. And then what that helps us do is it helps us to develop a dialogue with first ourselves, right? And to understand all the different parts of us, all the different things that still need attention and tending to. And once we have that dialogue started with ourselves via the writing that we're doing, we can build on that, and that helps us to then have better conversations and connect more to other people in our lives.
Yeah. Liz, as you're speaking, it's a journey, no question. It's a tough, challenging journey to go on, to discover who you are, to figure out all what that means. But there's got to be people listening to this who may take a different view and just say, you know what, you spoke about rewriting the truth. What if we didn't tell people the truth, didn't tell kids the truth right at the beginning? Then they'd never know. If, especially in a situation where it was like with yourself, as you say, you fit in with the family you lived with. It wasn't obvious that you were an adoptee. Why not give them all that bother and just don't tell them at the beginning? What would you say to those people?
Yeah, I would say that's an even worse path to take, because that happens and people will find out. I talk with adopted people all the time. I work with adopted people all the time. And these are like adults in their, some of them are in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. Some of them did not find out until they were in their 50s or 60s, when their parents died and they were going through paperwork and they found their adoption papers, and then they like started to put the pieces together. No wonder I've always felt strange my whole life. No wonder I've never really felt fully connected to this family. No wonder I'm different. Because they still have that same internal experience of like, something's not right here. So I think the truth is really important, but the truth can be really challenging for people, because we live in a culture that doesn't want to acknowledge certain darker aspects, right? And like I think it comes back, especially in adoption, right? There's so much shame around things like infertility, and there's so much pressure put on people to sort of check those boxes about like what a family looks like and how you should follow the rules of, like, I'm going to get married, I'm going to grow up, I'm going to have a family. And then if my body doesn't comply with that, like, then what's wrong with me? And there's no space for that grief and to unpack any of that. And so that's where the lies come in. And I think what I would also say to those people is turn that around. Like, if you had not been told, right? If you had not been told that if you had believed for your whole life that your parents were your parents, and then you found out at 50 or 60 years old that you had been lied to your whole life, how would you feel?
Yeah, totally.
What would that, I mean, like, there's a mental health crisis connected to the lies, the secrecy, the shame, right?
Yeah.
That's why I do what I do.
Everything you thought was true about you suddenly is not.
In the world we live in today of DNA tests, of Facebook, all those sorts of medical investigations, you go and you have some kind of, there's so many reasons why it could come out.
Yeah.
You don't have that kind of trauma at the end where you figure out the whole thing has been a lie. What has that done though for you finding out finally who your birth mother was? What did that do to your relationship with your adopted mother or your adopted family? How has that been impacted?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's, there's been, you know, some difficult conversations. Most of them started when I was working on Unmothered,
Mm.
because my parents are of the generation that was told that that adoption was the thing you did if you couldn't have children on your own, and that if you give, a kid a loving home with two parents
Mm.
who have jobs and are stable, that everything's going to be okay. And they weren't given any support, and they weren't given any tools to understand that, like, there was actually trauma attached to this situation, and they were going to have two kids who were going to need attention that they also needed to
Mm.
go to therapy, right? To unpack some of their own stuff. And so when I got into my PhD work and was started to do more research, because of having told, the first story that I told, which was called Unanswered Questions, while I finished my master's degree. And then I went down this road of, like, doing all the adoption research and reading The Primal Wound and reading Journey of the Adopted Self and all of the books that are suggested to read to understand the impact of adoption and how trauma manifests over the lifespan. I then felt like it was really important for me to continue to tell my story. And they didn't, like, for the first 2 years of my grad program, my dad kept saying to me, but this adoption stuff, it's just on the side, right? And I was like, no, 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 Dad. Actually, it's my work. Like, it's what I'm working with, because here's, like, adopted people have much higher rates of attempting and dying by suicide than non-adopted people. And there are significant, mental health challenges that go unaddressed. I mean, I spent 15 years in therapy never talking about adoption, right? And the more that I learned and connected it to my own experience, the more I realized, like, I needed to do this work, not just for myself, but for other people. And so, like, my parents, there were a lot of difficult conversations, because they can't separate that I can both have had a really loving
Mm.
and supportive life with and because of the way that they raised me, and also have all of this trauma
Mm.
because of being separated from my mother at birth.
Yeah.
And so when I finally got in touch with my first mom, Mary, it took me 2 years to tell them,
Okay.
because of
Wow.
all of the difficulty in getting them to understand what Unmothered was about, and why I was doing the work that I was doing, and why it was important to my growth and my healing and my claiming my identity for real. And so I kind of have to compartmentalize a little bit.
Mm.
I If they ask about her, I'll share some things, but I don't willingly volunteer
Yeah.
information, because it still feels uncomfortable, and there is a certain amount of defensiveness,
Yeah.
especially when it comes up with my mom.
Yeah. I
And
can understand that.
I was going to say they're still on their journey, though, thinking, aren't they enough? Because they would have done the best that they could for you. So
Yeah.
I get that.
Yeah.
What?
I'm going to be controversial here.
Well, I wanted to know, what would you say to people adopting kids now? What have you learned from the work that you've done with all these people who've been carrying these wounds and the trauma associated with adoption? What would you like to say to anybody adopting children now?
what I would like to say to them is, one, go to therapy, find an adoption and trauma competent therapist, and do your own work first,
Mm-hmm.
so that you are prepared to support a child who is coming into your life, who is going to be traumatized regardless of the amount of love and care and support that you can provide, right? That's thing one. Thing two would be to always keep the conversation going. Let them know what that they are adopted, why they were adopted. If it's possible to have a relationship with the first family, the family of origin, do everything that you can to maintain open lines of communication and to maintain that connection. If it's safe, right? Sometimes it's not safe, and I get that. And also, if you need support around that, find the appropriate support so that you can maintain those relationships for the sake of the child, right? In the US, open adoption is not legally enforceable, and the majority of quote unquote open adoptions close because first parents have a lot of fragility and they cannot handle having the child having a relationship with the first mother, first family.
Just to be clear, is that what you mean by open adoption? Is that having that connection with the first family?
With the
Open and transparent about the adoption. With the
Yeah.
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 Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. Thank you for asking that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and I would, and I would also suggest, as soon as possible, having the child in therapy. And that looks different at different developmental stages, right? There's play therapy, and then there's, trauma informed therapy later, but having that child have access to being able to be in touch with their feelings, being able to talk about their feelings, being able to say, like, I'm confused, right? Like, the thing that I would have loved as a kid was to have someone say to me, like, what are you confused about? Or like, what questions do you have about being adopted? Right? Because then I might have been able to start to think about, like, well, I want to know, like, why my mother couldn't keep me, right? And like, these are not easy conversations. I get it, but like, and maybe, my parents wouldn't have had much of an answer, but at least I would have known that they were safe to go to,
Yeah.
right? That they could hold space for my grief and my pain and my confusion, right? That we could sit there together, and even if they could, said, like, listen, Liz, we don't know, but it's okay for you to feel sad about it.
Yeah.
Right? It's okay for you to miss her. Right?
I wanted to ask one other question, Liz, and I hope this doesn't open a can of worms or what have you, but you spoke about compartmentalizing between your families, and looking back at the title of your book, Unmothered, all the references are to mother. Have you had any success or any desire or interest in connecting your biological father? Has that been part of the journey at all for you, or not?
Yeah, that's a great, it's a good question, and often biological fathers are left out of these conversations. I'm a 70s baby, and anybody that was, sort of born in the, I mean, still, it doesn't really matter decades wise, but especially like early, 70s and earlier, a lot of men didn't know, they didn't know. And for me, so as I said, there was no father named on my birth certificate. And when I first started talking with Mary, my first mom, she shared with me that the information that's on my non-identifying information, which is the paperwork that I have copies of from the adoption agency that I had gotten when I was maybe about 20 years old, because that was one of the first times that I started to feel like, okay, something's wrong and maybe it's about being adopted. She shared with me that the information on that paperwork was not my biological father, that it was her boyfriend who went with her, who she started seeing after she was already pregnant. And so when I first met her, she couldn't even remember his name.
Right.
And I do have a couple of years later, I was visiting the area where she lives, and we had lunch, and she gave me a little slip of paper, and I still have it in my wallet with somebody's name on it. I'm pretty sure that's who it is. I'm not 100% sure. And I have some hesitancy around reaching out to a person who probably doesn't even know I exist.
Yeah.
You know,
That would be quite something for them, but not a laughing matter. I mean, that could be a bolt from the blue, as you say. At least your mom knew what had happened. If your biological dad had no idea, that could be life transforming, and
Yeah. So, and I have a lot of adoptee friends who have had really positive experiences with the
Mm,
same, the same circumstance, like reaching out,
mm,
to people that didn't know they existed, and being completely like embraced and
mm,
welcomed and having beautiful relationships with these men. And I think for me, my whole life, I was always curious about her. I wanted to know who my mother was.
yeah.
I wanted, like I felt that need to know whose body I came from.
Mm,
Yeah.
mm,
And it was less intense for me to know about my biological dad.
wow.
Um, and then there's probably a whole nother podcast episode in there about.
Yes, I don't know if it kind of was, but the question was just sitting on me about that.
Yeah.
We had a interesting conversation with another guest recently who wasn't talking about adoption. She was talking about
Or childhood trauma.
blended families
Blended.
and together and so on. And interesting language that she used there was, rather than talking about a stepchild, a stepdaughter or son, she spoke about a bonus daughter or son, where the language, the messaging was different. Is there language that you found in the adopted world that can be more positive or negative? What works in that space?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up language because language has the power to shift culture, and that's the whole concept of rewriting the truth, right? Like being able to reclaim a narrative by rewriting the truth. That's about claiming language that is true for us at any given part of our journey. And my language around adoption has really shifted in the last decade or so of my own journey.
Mm,
I used to say my biological mother, my biological family, before I had any connection to her, before I had any knowledge of them, um, because that was the language that felt true at that point in time, because there was that disconnection.
yeah.
But now that I know her, I choose to use the term first mom
Hmm.
because she is my first mom,
Hmm.
right? So I think that there's language that people use that has to evolve based on where they are in, as I said, in the journey. But I do think that it's really detrimental to consume mainstream media narratives which paint adoption as a very positive thing and tell adopted people that we need to be grateful and that we're lucky and that we're chosen,
Hmm.
because when you internalize those messages and those narratives, it's another layer of confusion that you have to work really hard to unpack. And so I think we have to think about humanizing language that humanizes all people that are attached to adoption. So that's the shift between like biological or birth versus first mother.
Hmm.
Like the term birth mother to me is so dehumanizing because it's like as distilling that human down to a womb, right?
Yeah,
To
Yeah.
a
yeah.
vessel
They did,
who
yeah,
has,
yeah.
and
Production.
that's
Yeah.
that's gross.
Mm,
So I think people need to think about the language that they're using and how it's landing on the ears of those who are hearing it.
mm.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, so things that you don't even think about until you're in there and you're feeling the weight of the words. What do you think? What have you found this has done for you? Reclaiming your narrative, filling in the bits that you felt have been missing or confusing you, connecting with your first mother and the conversations you've had since. What difference has that made for you?
And maybe as a final thought, 'cause I'm conscious of time here now. We're kind of in time. It's really what a conversation we've had.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's been a beautiful conversation. Yeah. For me, what all this has done, it has given me a greater sense of wholeness, right? And so you take it back to like why I've named the thing that I do Migrating Toward Wholeness, because that's very much my experience. It's been a migration toward a greater sense of wholeness. And like it's an evolving thing. Like healing is a nonlinear journey. I am much more healed and whole now than I was 2 years ago, than I was 5 years ago, definitely than I was 10 years ago.
Mm.
But what all of this has done for me has enabled me to show up in the world as a much more integrated and authentic self. I have a lot more agency and a lot more autonomy because I have become the subject of my own story. I have become the author of my own life. And so when I think about, what I might want to tell other people is there are like, you all have your 4 habits. I have the 4 A's. And
Mhm.
for me, that's autonomy, that's agency, that's alignment, and that's authenticity. And that's what this has done for me.
Wow.
Amazing. And that's what you're now able to offer to others through the work that you do, which
Yes.
is a cue, I think, for us to say, so how do people get in touch with you, Liz? How do they find out about your work?
Yeah, they can find me on the web at www.lizdebetta.com. Super easy. And also the same at at Dr. Liz DeBetta on all the socials, but you can just Google me. I'm very easy to find.
Okay, and we'll put some stuff in the show notes. If you let us have some of those links, that'd be great. And what about the books? Tell us quickly about the books.
And the
Yeah.
play, if it's a play or a show.
Yeah, so you can also the book Adult Adoptees and Writing to Heal is available. You can either click on the image on my homepage of my website in order to get it. It's also available on Amazon. And the show Unmothered, you can also find information about how to book that directly on my website. And that show travels. So for folks wherever you are in the world listening, and if you want to bring the show to you, let's talk about it.
Oh,
Amazing.
I have
Amazing.
learned so much here today. I have to say about the journey of adopting. There are people clearly that we know who have been on this journey, but yeah, there's a whole lot of stuff that we've unpacked. So thank you, Liz. Thank you for sharing so
vulnerably. Yeah. Really
and in a way
appreciate
that's
that.
really impactful. I think for now we need to say it's a wrap.
Yes. Anything else will have to be part 2 because there's so much more that we could talk about. But let's see the questions that come in as a result. Thank you so much for sharing so openly.
Absolutely. I was going to say to the audience around the world, if you have any questions in this space, anything else you'd like to find out that you'd like to have Liz come back and talk about, let us know. Put your thoughts in the comments beneath, or maybe send us an email. And let's keep this conversation going. So much that I've learned. Wow. But Liz, thank you so much. Thanks for being with us, and maybe to a round 2 sometime.
Yes, indeed. And to our audience around the world, thank you for being with us again.
Okay.
Thanks for tuning in to the 4 Habits podcast. Now, if today's episode resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget, take our free relationship skills quiz at the4habits.com/skills quiz to start improving your relationships today. Hit subscribe and we'll see you next time.